electronic device. We are going to be in the New International Version, which is the version that is in our pews, page 977. And I want to begin. We're going to look at verses 1 through 12 today. And I want to just begin again, kind of read the two verses from last week. And James, the half-brother of Jesus, says, James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes, scattered among the nations, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all that they do. Believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position, but the rich should take pride in their humiliation, since they will pass away like a wild flower. For the sun rises with scorching heat and withers the plant. Its blossom falls and its beauty is destroyed. In the same way, the rich will fade away even while they go about their business. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. And let's pray. God, thank you for the fact that we can come here today and just get together to kind of take a collective breath from the week, to enjoy each other's presence, to pray for one another, to worship one another, and God, to be transformed by your word. So I pray this morning that you will open our hearts, that you will open our minds, that we may not only learn from you, but as I said, when we leave this place, be a little different than we were when we came in. We'll thank you as always for it in Jesus' name. Amen. Everybody has a bad day. Now, sometimes I'm fond of using the phrase that God tried to kill me, and it seemed like he tried to kill me, and he kept missing. Some people have asked me, where did you get that phrase at? Well, it was from a book, one of the last books that Zig Ziglar wrote, called Over the Top, and he was actually citing a story, apparently from way back in the 80s, that was a documented story about a guy who had a very bad day. I'm going to read the story because I think it's probably the best way to handle it. Brian Heiss lives in Provo, Utah. One day he awoke to find a leak in the ceiling of his apartment. Anybody ever woke up to a leak? Yeah. The water was dripping in his face, so he jumped out of bed and called his landlord to see what could be done about the problem. When he stood up, he splashed in the water that was already gathering on the carpet. His landlord told him quickly to rent a water vacuum. Brian tore down the flight of stairs to get in his car to go rent a wet vac, but he discovered that all 4 of his tires on his car were flat. He went back upstairs, reached for the phone, and was shocked so severely it knocked him down. Brian then shouted for a friend and asked him to take him to get help. When he got back downstairs, Brian found that someone had stolen his car. He knew it didn't have much gas, so he and his friend walked a few blocks, found the car, pushed it to a service station, and put gas in the tank and air in the tires. Brian later returned home and went upstairs to get dressed for an ROTC graduation ceremony that he had scheduled that night. He donned his uniform and tried to get out of the house, but the water that had caused the door to swell in its frame, he had to scream until someone could come and kick in the door from the outside. Having a bad day yet? When he finally jumped in his car, he immediately realized that he had sat on his bayonet, which he had carelessly left in the driver's seat. Brian was taken to the hospital for, as Zig puts it, some very strategic surgery. Friends took him home. When Brian opened the door, he saw the falling plaster had toppled the cage of his prized pet canaries, killing all of them. As he ran to the birds across the wet carpet, he slipped. He hurt his back so badly, he had to be taken to the hospital again. By this time, a newspaper reporter caught up with Brian and asked him, Mr. Heiss, how could you explain all of this happening to one person in a single day? And Brian answered, it looked like God was trying to kill me, but he kept missing. Well, that's where that phraseology comes from. You know, when sometimes, I don't know about you, but when you have a bad day, if you hear somebody else had a worse day, does it ever make you feel a little better? I mean, it's kind of weird, kind of sick, but you go, oh, well, I'm good. You know, you hear what somebody else is going through and you're thinking, okay, I thought I had it bad until I read the story of this guy. Well, sometimes if I feel like I'm having a bad day, I go back and read about him and say, nothing gets that bad in one single day. This guy should hold the record in the Guinness Book of World Records for the bad day. We all have bad days. We all have, well, trouble that comes our way. There are times that we face trouble in life, and sometimes it seems like that no matter what we do, we have nothing but trouble. Sounds like that for this young man, that he had nothing but trouble. And sometimes you probably feel like that too. You ever been there? Where it feels like that some things are just not going right, that no matter what you do, there's just trouble around every corner. And it seems like you can't catch a breath, that you can't get a break, that it seems like no matter what happens, it seems like even something that's good seems to be turned into trouble. And what often happens with us is that those troubles can derail us in life. A lot of people will often use this very issue of trouble to not believe in God anymore, or to walk away from their faith. To say, well, I've got so much trouble, and if God really loved me, He wouldn't let me have any trouble in my life. He wouldn't let any of this stuff happening. As a matter of fact, life would be smooth sailing, like God would be the ultimate lawnmower parent that mows everything over, and so you don't ever have an obstacle to overcome. You never have any kind of problem to deal with in your life. Everything is just fine, and God's the big lawnmower parent in the sky, but He's not. The problem is that a lot of times we will allow troubles to kind of derail us. Trouble comes in a relationship that we have, and it literally derails the relationship. Instead of trying to figure out what do we got to do to get it back on the rails, we let it derail us. You may be going through that right now in a relationship. Maybe you're dealing with a child or a grandchild that's gone off the rails. And it seems like there's just nothing but trouble over and over and over again. You just can't seem to catch a break with them. You look at it, you look at your kid, or you look at the grandkid, and you think, man, I raised you better than that. I took you to church. We went, you saw this example, and you're figuring out, why are they making the stupid choices that they're making? Sometimes trouble comes in our work. You got a boss that tries to derail you constantly. No matter what happens, it seems like the boss is picking at you. That no matter what happens, whatever anybody else does, they seem to get away with it. But the moment that you do something that he or she catches you in the middle of it, it's like, oh, and it seems like they're after you. They got it out for you. Trouble at work, trouble at home, trouble in the community, trouble in our nation. It seems like we are surrounded by trouble. Now, it's easy when it happens for it to also derail your attitude, to allow us to become people that are pessimistic, that rather than saying, hey, good morning, Lord, we go, good Lord, it's morning. You know what they said, the optimist is what's it, Zig Ziglar said, the optimist is somebody who will go after Moby Dick in a rowboat and take the tartar sauce, right? The pessimist is somebody that falls down the stairs and says, I'm glad I got that over with. Let's go. It can literally derail our attitude. And we wound up letting those troubles that we have literally define who we become. And that's why this morning we're going to talk about nothing but trouble. And I think it's interesting that if you weren't here, you can go back to YouTube and watch the message from last week, because it really lays the context of why James is talking about what he's talking about. Now, just to backpedal a little bit, to backtrack for some backstory, it's really interesting that James comes out of the starting gate, and he says, my brethren, count it all joy when you experience these various trials. That the first thing he talks about that these people are facing is trouble. Now, why is that? Well, James, of course, is writing to Jewish believers who have been dispersed. They've been dispersed for several reasons. Under the reign of Claudius, it was a horrible time. So the Romans didn't like the Jews, and the Jews didn't like the Jewish Christians. So these people literally were suffering. They had hardship at every single turn. They were threatened. There were problems. There were pressures, and likely it was easy for them to want to give up or to ask the same question that we will often ask. And that is, God, why? why are you doing this? Why don't you stop it? Or as the guy said in our opening story, why are you trying to kill me and you keep missing? Connect already. Enough's enough. And so James found it necessary to address what happens when trouble comes our way. So we're going to look at this very quickly this morning because it's interesting how he actually addresses these things. So when he starts out, I don't really, when I first read this, I remember early on in the faith, I was like, okay, James is sick. He's got a problem. Because he says, consider it all joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. Can I just tell you that joy is not my first emotion when trouble comes my way? Usually it's anger or it's rage or it's something more significant than, yay, yippee, joy, I've got problems. That's what it sounds like he's saying. That's actually not what he's saying. But he says, consider all joy, my brothers. Now notice what he says. Whenever you face various trials. So we're going to come back to the consider it joy. He says, consider it joy if you face problems in your relationships. Consider it joy if you face challenges raising your children. Consider it joy if you face financial issues. Consider it joy if you face employment issues. Consider it joy if you face business issues. That's not what he said. He said, consider it joy whenever you face various trials. The idea here is that it's not if, it's when. It's going to happen. You can count on it. And if you haven't faced it at all, look out. It's coming. And it may be big. Are you glad you came to church? Isn't that great? It's going to happen. The point is that he's telling us trials, testings, trouble that we will face in life are inevitable. Now, why is that? Well, I believe the scriptures teach that we live in what's called a fallen world because of something called sin. Now, I know people who sin is, you said archaic term. It was actually an archery term that meant to miss the mark. It means that nobody's perfect. I can show you 5 days a week that people are born in sin right here on this campus, probably within about 30 minutes. If you're not sure, I would invite you to come and observe in the preschool. Because our kids, the kids that come in here, you know what we have to teach them? We don't have to teach them to be selfish. You know what word they often have? They know right away? Mine. That's mine. And we got to teach little Johnny or Sally to share. There is a bent right away that this is mine, that it's all about me. Johnny, you have to sit down with all the other kids. Sally, you've got to stay in line. You can't just walk out of the line and go do, because Sally wants to do her own thing. Johnny wants to do our own thing. Does it sound like anybody you know, kind of like maybe your kids? That you had to teach them to stay in line, that you had to teach them to open the door for other people, that you had to teach them that the world literally doesn't revolve around them, that it also revolves around other people. You had to teach them to say thank you, teach them to be grateful, teach them to acknowledge. You have to teach them to do all of that because their bent is in a totally different direction. Call it whatever you want, but we live in a fallen world. And because we live in a world of fallen people that are imperfect, trouble is going to come our way because there's people in it. And because we're in it. And so what he says is, listen, they were dealing with people issues right now. In James, they were dealing with persecution and with problems with people that have perspective towards them from the Romans, from the Jews who didn't like the Jewish believers, and on it went. So they were dealing with a people issue. They were dealing with the sin issue. And so James says, whenever this happens, consider it joy. Consider it joy that the trial happened. Consider it joy that you got trouble. No, he says, consider it joy, my brothers and sisters, because here's why you consider it joy. Here's why you have a better attitude towards trouble when it comes, knowing that your testing produces perseverance. I hope you all are reading that. Does he say knowing that your testing produces perseverance? No. Knowing that the testing of your what? Faith. He says, these trials this trouble, when it comes, is a testing of your faith that can produce perseverance. Perseverance, the idea of the Greek word there is endurance, that you are under the weight of it. That it is like as somebody who runs an endurance race, that you keep going when you feel like giving up. That when you feel like you need to stop, that you keep on going. And he says what happens is this trial and this pressure that you are facing can actually make your faith stronger, make you more enduring. And he says, so because of that, consider it joy and get a different perspective on it, knowing that you are going to learn more from your trouble than you will from anything else. How many times have we done that in our own lives? When you think about it, we wind up learning. I learn more from the painful times than I do the positive times. And have you ever noticed, I don't know whether this happens to you, but if I don't learn from the painful time, it seems to repeat itself later, and I go, man, this looks eerily familiar. You ever had that happen? You know, and then if you repeat it a third time, it's like, okay, third time's a charm, God. I got this. I know I got to learn something from this. And so James says, listen, when these things come your way, know this, consider it joy, because God is going to do something with your faith. And then he says, but not only is it going to be perseverance will finish its work. So that he says, watch this. And I don't really like this. He says, so that your faith is going to be mature and that you will lack nothing. I look at my 55-year-old self and look back at the decisions that I made when I was younger and go, man, was that stupid. I look sometimes at it and think, what was I thinking? But now that I'm older and more mature, and I've had experiences because I failed, because I went the wrong way, because I made wrong decisions, because I went through painful experiences, I will look at it and I'll try to keep my children from going through those same painful experiences. You ever done that? It's like, no, son, daughter, this is what's going to happen. And they go, and what do? They go their own way, and you look at your spouse and go, man, what's the matter with them? And then you suddenly realize, wait a minute, I did the same thing. Because now I'd have a lot to say to my 15-year-old self and my 16-year-old self and my 18-year-old self and my 22-year-old self and my 25-year-old self at 55, because I have these experiences that hopefully have been the maturing factor for me that have given me wisdom. He says your faith is no different. You learn from those troubles and those trials how to endure, and it shapes your faith. And he says you learn that perseverance, and what it does is then you get maturity. But he goes on and says something interesting. He says so you're lacking nothing. But then he says, look, so what do you do if you lack that wisdom? Very simple, verse 5. He says, if any one of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. So he says, listen, if you don't know how to face these troubles when it comes, he doesn't say run to your neighbor. He doesn't say put it on Facebook and whine about it. He doesn't say put a tweet up. He doesn't say go around and tell everybody else about it. He says if you're not sure how to face a trial, he says go to God, and you don't say, notice he says go to God and say, God, take the trouble away. Right? He doesn't do that. He says, no, go to God and say, God, you got to give me the wisdom here. And then James goes on to say, you got to ask in faith, because if not, then he explains all of this. And he says, and he wraps up in verse 8 and says, such a person is double-minded and he's unstable in all of his ways. So if you don't ask in faith, he says, you better go and you better believe that God's going to do that, and you better make sure that you ask in faith. And then James seems to go off the rails in the middle of this. Notice what he says. He says, believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position. What? What does that have to do with trials? What does that have to do with trouble? Well, believers in low circumstances, he says they ought to actually be sort of joyful about this. It's that joy thing again, and actually take pride in the fact that they're in a higher position than somebody else. He says, but the rich, they ought to take pride in their humiliation. This is what Jesus said. The last shall be first and the first shall be last. That Jesus taught the way to up is down. The way to excel is to serve. And so he says the rich should take pride in their humiliation. Sun rises with a scorching heat. Where there's a plant, its blossom falls, and its beauty is destroyed. In the same way, the rich will fade away even while they go about their business. And then he wraps it back up. because obviously they were facing financial problems. And as we will see later, there were actually believers, when they would go into their assembly, that had more money and had more power, that would actually look on them and go, what are you doing? There was like a caste system in the church based on what somebody had. And then he wraps up and he says, blessed. The word blessed means happy, means joyful. Is the one who perseveres, there it is again, who endures under trouble or trial, because having stood the test, listen to the eternal perspective, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. Wow. I don't know about you, but that's a really weird perspective on trouble. I'm not the guy who jumps up and down and is happy in trouble, but James actually gives us a really important lesson. Because I think often what will happen is our trouble, as we talked about, can derail us. And then once it derails us, we will be defined by it if we let it happen. We will be defined by a failed relationship. We'll be defined by a failed business. We'll be defined by a failed job. We'll be defined by failing personally because of an addiction or morally or whatever else it is that happens. We will allow those things, that trouble, to define us, and then we allow ourselves to become what that trouble was. We don't let it change us. And that's his whole thing is don't let the trouble define you. Don't let it derail you and then become the defining factor of who you are in your life. As a matter of fact, I think what James is teaching us here is that when trouble comes our way, that we should let the trouble tailor us. We should let the trouble tailor us. You ever had to go get a dress tailored or a suit tailored, and they come out, they're measuring everything to get it perfectly fit on you? If not, you get the thing, the sleeves are too big or the stuff's too long and it looks really baggy and you look like really weird in it until they actually tailor it. God is saying here, listen, don't let these things define you. Don't let them derail you and define you. Actually let the trouble tailor you and become, so that you become more mature, that your faith grows and that you become a better person and that you have more wisdom and that you have more direction and you become a more mature spiritual individual. That the trouble can actually tailor us. The question is, how do we actually do that? Well, we read it a little earlier. I said I would come back to it. James gives it to us in those four things. In verse 2, he says, consider it joy. Consider. Stop for a moment and think about it. And then he says, no, knowing that the producing of your faith produces endurance, that you actually have to have this knowledge about it. And then he says in verse 4, but did you get that? Let patience have its perfect work. In other words, he says, when the trouble comes, you're actually going to have to surrender to it. It's like I've used in my grief programs over the years, talked about grief. Grief is one of those things that when the emotions come, the first thing that people do is they stand and they're going to fight it. You try to fight the emotion. I'm not going to cry, I'm not going to cry, I'm not going to cry. And then what do? You cry. I'm not going to do it, I'm not going to do it. You go on a diet. I'm not going to eat chocolate cake. You eat chocolate cake. I'm not going to do it, not going to do it. Boom. It's like I've done before with you. Don't think about a purple elephant. Now you can't quit thinking about a purple elephant. So the bottom line is with grief, what often happens is that if you can actually surrender to the emotion and not fight it, it's like a wave that's coming at you out at the ocean. You actually get on that wave, you turn into it, and it takes you back to shore. You don't fight it. If you fight it, it's going to knock you over. So he says, the trouble comes, and the question that we should ask then, nothing wrong with asking the why question, by the way. When people say, don't question God, don't ever ask him why, he's the only one that can answer your questions. But I think sometimes we get stuck in that endless loop of why. The question needs to be, okay, God, I got some financial issues going on. Okay, God, I got some relationship issues going on. Okay, God, I need to find a job here. Okay, God, you can fill in the blank, whatever the trouble is. And then what he says is, okay, God, I'm going to go through this. I'm going to ride the wave. And then he says the final thing was what? To ask for wisdom. God, give me wisdom to know how to ride the wave. Because when I get to shore, my faith is going to be stronger, I'm going to be more mature, and I'm going to be better. That is a whole different perspective. And that is the toughest perspective to get to. Because when trouble comes, the first thing we do is, why did this happen to me? And we grit our teeth, and we can't figure out why it's happening to us, and it's not happening to somebody else, and why does it keep happening to me over and over and over again? And it's okay to ask the why question, but then you become in this judgment pattern. Step over and say, okay, God, now what? We're in this thing together. What can I learn from this? Because I'm going to tell you something. As I said earlier, if you don't learn it, it's like you're destined to repeat it until you learn it again. And it'll come you in a different direction until finally one day after the fourth or fifth time you go, usually it takes me 3 or 4. And then I'll go, oh, I got it. Now I got it. Now I need to learn this. Now there's something that I need to understand here. Because the bottom line is that we sometimes let these things derail us and define us. But we need to let our trouble tailor us to become all that God, the individual that He wants us to be. We'll be better, and the world will be better, and we'll be able to better reach people. There's a story from the book is called Change Your Questions, Change Your Life. And it's one of these business books that's written from a novel perspective. And so one of the characters in there is actually quoting a story by a gentleman by the name of Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell was a mythologist and a storyteller, and I've written some fascinating books. There was an entire series done about Joseph Campbell on public television, and I have like an audio book that goes on for hours that was interviews of him. But Campbell tells a story, and I just have to read it to you. Campbell says, it seemed a farmer was out working his field when his plow caught on something and it wouldn't budge. The horse reared up and the farmer cursed. After calming the horse, the farmer yanked back on the braces, but the plow still wouldn't budge. Because he was an impatient man, his first reaction was to start judging. He had a rock or another obstacle broken his plowshare. That could mean losing at least 2 days' work while he hauled the broken parts to the blacksmith. Cursing, again, he began digging around to free the plow. To his surprise, he discovers that it was caught on an iron ring buried 6 inches under the ground. After freeing his plow, the farmer got curious. The farmer quit asking, why did this happen? And what's going on? He cleared some of the old dirt and pulled on the iron ring. Off came the lid of an ancient chest. He peeked down inside it. Before him, glittering in the sun, lay a treasure of precious jewels and gold. Now, the author in the story goes on and says, this story reminds us that it is often by confronting our toughest obstacles that we find our greatest strengths and possibilities. But sometimes we have to dig deep to find them. When trouble comes, let it tailor you. Let's pray.